Hi, I am Alienjack. In the year and a half since my interview with Jeff Holiday on YouTube, I have been asked by many people how things were going with me and with my kids. Um, I have been silent most of this time, uh, and that was due overwhelmingly to fear of making things worse because they haven't been going well. At first, it seemed like they were, but the money ran out almost immediately. Um, I've been without representation for over a year. I have been denied access to pro bono legal services by the local Bar Association's gatekeeper organization, and I've got nowhere else to turn. My older son has recently been hospitalized for depression and suicidal thoughts, which he has expressly stated were due to the fact that he hasn't seen his baby brother in months. Neither have I. And also to the fact that he no longer sees me nearly as much as he used to. We used to share custody of him 50-50, and he's been seeing me far less often than that. And recently, his mother has decided to withhold him from me completely, not allow him to contact me, in direct violation of the current custody order, which he is now also trying to change. It's mostly for my older boy that I'm doing this. He's 10, and he is thinking about killing himself because he has been torn from his family. The worst part about this is that there's nothing I can do. I guess I'm doing something now, but the feeling of helplessness while your child suffers is something that, unless you've experienced it yourself, you could never imagine it. Things have gotten to where they are with him in part because his mother and her attorney have taken steps to suppress his testimony and his input on his custody case and that of his brother. He feels as if he's been prevented from having a say in his own life. He loves his mom, but he feels like this is very unfair and that she is hurting him. And she is. At the end of this video, I'm going to be showing and reading, if I can get through it, a letter that he wrote. He gave it to me on the last day that I saw him, and he asked me to get it to his little brother. Since I don't know where his little brother is at the moment, there's no way I can do that. But I'm going to put that out there so that you can see it. And hopefully we can get the help we need to put ourselves back together. All this kid wants is to have a life with both sides of his family. He wants his family back. When I spoke to his therapist told me that he talks about me constantly, that he considers me his hero, and I know that his mother is extremely unhappy about that. There's been acrimony between us for years, and it's all been because of him. She feels that her baby is her baby and belongs to her only, and she needs to have complete control over him. This is, to me, an incredibly irresponsible and almost malicious act. She's hurting him. His stepmom is hurting him. She has been trying to take him from me for years. She tried twice during my marriage to my wife, and she failed both times. But since the recent issues with my wife cropped up, she was very successful. In fact, she and my wife have been working together in order to make sure that they both got what they want. They hated each other before this. I guess they're working together because they hate me more. I'm going to start out tonight. Well, first of all, tonight is mostly about some very disturbing information that I learned about my wife and about why I became sick. You may have watched the previous video and wondered why a 48-year-old man needed open heart surgery. Actually, my doctors wondered that too. And I found out. And the answers to that are horrifying. And the fact that I can't do anything about it is more horrifying still. But before we get to that, for those of you who have been wondering, I'm going to give you a brief as I can make it, overview of the things that have happened since my interview with Jeff Holiday. I'm going to have to make future videos to cover these topics in depth because I can't get to all the details, not nearly all of them. And everything that has happened deserves to be covered in depth. I need to show supporting documentation, evidence, background, so that you can get a grasp on just what kind of an injustice is being done here. So let's begin with the overview, beginning from my video interview with Jeff Holiday. As you may know, I had a GoFundMe campaign, and I did end up closing it down after it exceeded the amount that I had requested for it. But there were some issues with that. Number one, I had never been in this kind of a situation before, and I had no idea how much money I truly needed. It was laughable, actually, how far the money I collected got me. And in addition to that, I had some issues with GoFundMe and their payment partner, WePay. Namely, GoFundMe took about 10% of the total that was collected, and their payment partner, WePay, claimed that close to $8,000 in the donations were canceled. Although GoFundMe didn't change the campaign collection total on the webpage to reflect this. As a result, I was actually about close to $10,000 short of my goal. But even had I actually met that goal, it wouldn't have been close. So when I asked for the details of these transactions that were canceled, and I did get a little readout saying that they were canceled on my dashboard, GoFundMe sent me a link to supposedly a Microsoft Excel file that would show the details of every transaction. And when I clicked on it and downloaded it, it was empty. I experienced numerous other problems with GoFundMe, with their customer service, and with WePay. And I ended up terminating my relationship with GoFundMe and trying to move forward on my own. As you may remember from the last video, there was an assault by my wife on July 20th, 2016. And I did end up reporting that to the police in Upper Marion Township, Pennsylvania, where the assault occurred. An officer took a report, but ultimately nothing was done about it, even when I followed up with a request for charges to be filed. After my fundraiser, I contacted the lawyer who had represented me in my older son's previous custody cases, who did a very good job. And I was told, to my surprise, that I owed several $1,000s from those cases, and they would not be able to represent me as a result, even if I paid them that money back. It turns out my wife, who had been handling the finances in our marriage, had made a payment arrangement with them and had not kept it and hadn't told me about that. So I can only think, knowing what I know now, that she did it on purpose to keep me from getting competent representation when we finally split up, if I was even still alive. So I was desperate to find a lawyer, as you might imagine. I hadn't seen either of my children when I was used to having the baby around every day and my older son around half the time. And I looked around, I called places. I even went downtown on foot to legal offices and just showed up. And eventually I settled on the first lawyer I met, who would meet with me immediately and whose Google reviews were all positive. We're going to call him Mason Marpenter for the sake of convenience, because I need a name to hang on him. Of course, that's not his name. Mason claimed that he could and would take care of everything, and that we were going to win. And his confidence won me over, because I was desperately in need of good news from anybody. Later on, I found out that his Google reviews were not quite what they were appeared to be, and that at least some of them had been made by friends and family of his. It turns out that he was a relatively new lawyer, relatively inexperienced, actually very new and very inexperienced, and he ended up botching my cases so badly that after some initial gains that were based mostly on the weakness of my wife's case, I began losing far more ground than I had gained. He told me that he was giving me a discount from his normal rate. I remember what he said was, "My normal rate is $300 an hour, but I'll do, around $250 for you," he said. I thought this was a little weird. And later on, I found out that, in fact, his normal rate was $200 an hour, and he was gouging me. I found this out when he sent me another client's invoice along with mine in the mail, which listed as the default rate on her invoice $200 an hour. He did things like failed to file pretrial statements, failed to take notes during conferences and hearings. He showed up without important documentation at conferences and hearings. He couldn't be pressed to remember even the basic facts of the cases. He ignored the information and documentation I provided him with that gave him background and proof that supported our side. And on one occasion, he left me completely unrepresented at an important hearing in my older son's case, which I showed up for and was forced to represent myself for. He repeatedly missed opportunities to have my wife and my older son's mother charged with contempt of court, and he made excuses for all of those failures when I confronted him. He told me several lies in attempts to cover his mistakes and incompetence that I was able to later verify as false. But we'll get to that in another video. So next, upon learning that I was trying to have her served with court papers, you may remember my wife had gone to Oregon with the baby, completely across the country from here. Um, my wife filed a restraining order against me in Jackson County, Oregon, on her behalf and my baby son's. And this was a tactic to try and keep from having to come back to Pennsylvania to appear in court. I had to hire an Oregon attorney by phone to contest the restraining order in Oregon before we were able to legally compel her to return home with the baby. And while I was attempting to have her served, my wife reached out to one of her buddies in Oregon. Well, she doesn't have very many friends, honestly. It's the nature of her personality that people usually discover what kind of person she is and get sick of her after a while. And this guy was different, and yeah, he's a story all in himself. But we're not going to go into too much detail about that right now. Anyway, the guy works in IT security, and she told him that these people that were process servers who were trying to serve her with the custody papers were actually people that I had recruited from the internet to harass her at her parents' house. And she told him a bunch of other bull, and that got him started. First, it was Twitter. He attacked me on Twitter. He attacked Jeff Holiday on Twitter. And when he got some blowback from that, he ended up deleting his Twitter account and opening a sock puppet account that he used to harass me with and harass Jeff. And when that proved to be ineffective, he moved on to harassing me by mail, email, text, and telephone, using information provided by my wife because he didn't have access to that. So for the last year and a half, I've been relentlessly harassed. Jeff Holiday was also harassed to a pretty sick degree. And when he did it to Jeff, he posed as different members of my family who don't actually exist, saying there was all kinds of dirt on me and all this garbage. And anyway, they made Jeff's life hell. And Jeff declined to do a follow-up interview because of that, which I completely understand and totally don't blame him for. There's no reason to want to keep dealing with that. So after the initial motions were filed in both cases, I did regain partial custody of my boys for a short while, only to have it immediately reduced due to the incompetence, professional negligence, and fraudulent behavior of Mason Marpenter, my attorney. And in September 2016, I was driving home from one of these custody conferences that he botched, and I was broadsided by a teenage driver who ran a stop sign. My car was totaled. I was slightly injured. And the insurance company, instead of replacing my car or giving me a check for the full value, they paid off my car loan and gave me what was left over, which wasn't much. It wasn't nearly enough to buy another car. So I ended up buying another car using a little bit of the money that was remaining to me from my fundraiser. And it actually turned out to be a decent car, although it's pretty old, and I'm still driving it. It's a little beat up, it's a little ugly, but the point is I wouldn't have had to throw down out of pocket for that if that hadn't happened to me. It was like bad luck followed by worse luck followed by worse luck, and that was kind of what my life was like for a while. That's what it's like now. So In one of the pretrial custody conferences for my younger son, my wife's attorney showed the mediator a selected clip from the video with Jeff Holiday. In it, as you might recall, I was 2 weeks out of surgery. My chest still hurt so bad that I couldn't even close my shirt over it, and I was very weak from having my internal organs taken out and rearranged, and having my rib cage spliced together by titanium wires. I was still under medical restrictions, substantial ones, when that video was taken. And by the time that custody conference came around, I was in no way close to that kind of physical condition anymore. But despite that fact, my wife's attorney managed to convince the custody mediator that I deserved less time with my son because I might drop over dead at any moment. And Mason, of course, did absolutely nothing about this. I showed him that video on the day I met him, and he knew that parts of it could and would potentially be used against me, and he was unprepared and unable to even respond to those allegations. And it was that straw that really broke the camel's back with him. I started drafting a complaint against him to the disciplinary board of the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. I left a very brutal and very honest review on his Google Places page that included some text from an email that he had sent me in which he botched the English language so much that he looked like a complete moron. I will be including that little passage in a future video. Heck, I might even include it in this one. And then, of course, I received the invoice, where I got the other customer's invoice as well, and was able to see the price difference between what he was charging. And I'm going to show those here in this video for you. The first one I'm going to show you is a partial invoice, one of my partial invoices, at which you can see the rate I'm being charged. If you look down there, it says $250 an hour. And the other one, which you can see here, is his other client's invoice. And if you look down there, several times it says default rate, and then it shows the itemized rate in the rate column as $200. It was really just, it was too much. So I kind of went after him. And I had already sent him another $2,000. He said that my initial retainer that I had sent him had been exhausted and that I owed him more money. And so after I did that, after I drafted the complaint and I left the Google review, I was contacted by his insurance company, who began to offer me insultingly small amounts of money in exchange for my willingness to drop the complaint and remove my Google review. Now, they negotiated with me in bad faith. I was unrepresented. I had nobody to tell me that I was being given a raw deal. I had nobody to tell me how much more money he was going to cost me with his incompetence. So in the end, I took a laughably small amount because I was running out of cash and I was desperate. And I was almost recovered enough from my surgery to be up and about and doing stuff. But along the way, I found that I was recovering much more than I expected to. for reasons that we're going to get into as the main theme of this video. So after receiving that small partial payment, I searched around, I called lawyers, and I got another lawyer on a recommendation from a lawyer who claimed they were unable to represent me or take my cases. And I had the worst time finding lawyers, because at that point I had 4 cases going. It had mushroomed. Things were getting worse on a daily basis, and it was a nightmare to even try to explain what was going on to any one of them. I mean, it took me like 20 minutes on the phone to fully explain my situation. And most lawyers just, you could hear their jaw hit the floor. And so one lady was nice enough to refer me to another couple attorneys, and I called them both, and one of them said she would take my case. And she quoted me a retainer, but she also said that she was unable to represent me in all of my cases, and she would just take a single custody action for each child. And at that point, I had half the retainer to give her, so she said that was fine for now. And we got started. Now, around that time, there were a number of false allegations of child abuse that had been filed by my wife, and people acting on my wife's behalf. It happened over and over and over again. And my lawyer at the time was not able to represent me in those matters because she was working for the very organizations that were being weaponized against me. Now, you're probably not familiar with this, but in Pennsylvania, when someone is accused of child abuse, they're treated by the courts as guilty until proven innocent rather than the other way around. It's considered a special case. And in addition, the accused person is not allowed to even know what the allegations are in many cases, or the identity of the person making the accusations to begin with. And even after the investigation shows that the allegations are unfounded, the accused is not allowed access to any of the details of the investigation or its findings. And that includes the police investigations that often go along with this. So in other words, you're forced to defend yourself without knowing what you're accused of, who accused you, and what the investigators found as a result of the investigation. And in the end, you receive a very vague letter saying that no action need be taken at this time and that the case will be closed and blah, blah, blah. And it doesn't say, no, these allegations are false. It doesn't say, we think they were entirely made up or whatever. I mean, if this sounds unconstitutional to you, that's because it is. And if it sounds like something out of a Kafka novel, you'd be absolutely correct, because it is. The worst part of it all is that if a custody battle is going on during the time these unknowable allegations are being investigated, the judge, particularly a brand new, inexperienced judge like the one presiding over my younger son's case, often takes these allegations of fact and acts upon them accordingly. This is why these types of tactics are used so often against men in Pennsylvania custody actions. They're horrifyingly effective because there's no real way to defend against them. I complied with every investigation. I allowed my home to be searched over and over. I allowed my children to be interviewed over and over. And every investigation was closed. And I was given the same very vague letter. Well, they differ in substance, but not in substance. They differ in detail, but not in substance. And I was not given access to any details that I could use in my defense in custody court, whereas my opposition was able to use these same investigations against me. They knew what the allegations were. They were able to state that, and of course the judge had access to at least some of the details, and there was just no way to win. And my wife and her attorney kept making these false accusations over and over because they knew there would be no negative consequences for making the false reports. There's actually a law against knowingly making false reports of child abuse in Pennsylvania, but due to the way the system is set up, it's a law that is absolutely impossible to enforce. I know because I did try to have it enforced, and we're going to be covering that in great detail in a future video, if I ever live to make one. But moving on. So at the hearing for my older son, which came up shortly after all this stuff started, even though I had given my second attorney a great deal of material to support my case, and in my own defense, and stuff that really detracted from the credibility of the witnesses that were called against me, she presented almost no evidence. She brought a single witness to support my case, my mom, and completely failed to cross-examine the opposition's witnesses, despite having extensive dossiers on them and their background that I had given her in plenty of time to prepare for the hearing. In addition, I discovered that a pretrial statement had never been submitted to the court in support of my case, which is standard procedure. You're supposed to do that. And as a result of that hearing, I lost most of my time with my older son, and statements of supposed fact were entered into the record as part of the custody order that were directly provable as being false, using documentation that I had given my lawyer far ahead of time. And it turns out that she could have answered the allegations in the pretrial statement using that documentation, but she declined to do so. I don't know if it's because she, at that point, was working for Children and Youth Services, working for domestic relations, or just because I hadn't been able to give her enough money to pay enough attention to the case. And I realized afterwards that a major conflict of interest existed that prevented her from effective representation. And the fact that I had been unable to pay her more than half her retainer probably played a major part in my loss. I asked her to withdraw from my cases, and from that point, I was on my own. So at that point, I called the Gatekeeper Organization for pro bono legal services in Dauphin County, which is called Mid-Penn Legal Services. And I called them over and over, trying to get a pro bono lawyer, because I was out of money. I found them to be extremely unresponsive, very unhelpful. They ultimately told me that I didn't qualify for pro bono services, mainly because I couldn't prove that I had no money, which I don't know how you're supposed to. I mean, I said you can have my bank statements, and they said no, that wouldn't be it. And they talked about tax returns and pay stubs, and I hadn't worked since 2015, since I became extremely sick. And one thing that the girl who answers the phone expressed to me is that even if I did eventually qualify for pro bono legal services, they would not be able to provide services for all of my cases or even a significant portion of them. There's no provision for the handling a case like mine, or rather an interconnected network of cases like mine in their program. I had 4 active cases going. I was losing them all. One of them was a criminal case because of the marijuana. One of them was a domestic relations case, and the other 2 were custody cases. So out of desperation, I contacted other lawyers and law firms, and they all quoted me prices that were just unbelievable. And there was no way, even if I had gotten a job immediately, that I would be able to afford them. The one bright spot in all of this was that, I did get to see my kids at least some of the time. And there was another bright spot, and that was my dog was returned to me. Little Baxter came home. But even that was spoiled. When I got him back, I found out that he hadn't been adequately cared for. Pugs, well, my pug, I guess. I've never had another pug, so I don't know. They need their nails clipped pretty frequently, and or they need to be walked very frequently so that they can wear their claws down. Otherwise, their claws grow very long, just like if you never clipped your fingernails, except a dog's claws are different. They're very hard, they're very sharp, and there is a vein in the middle of them and nerves, so if you clip them too short, the dog bleeds and is in pain. I had always walked that fine line between, making sure his nails weren't too short and making sure they were adequately clipped. But right after I got him back, I noticed that one of his claws in his front paw had gotten so long that it curled around under his paw and was piercing the bottom of his foot. It was swollen, it was bloody, it was infected, he was limping, he was in pain. And it was heartbreaking. I mean, I couldn't afford to have a professional take care of him at that point. So, and he puts up a struggle when you go to clip his claws anyway. So it was very hard. It was very painful for me to do it and to watch. I had to clip the claw and pull the bloody stump of it out of the bottom of his foot. And then, I treated the infection with topical antibiotics and disinfectants, and I wrapped it up, and I changed a bandage every day, and I made sure he was okay. But to this day, that one toe of his, I guess, would be called a toe, I don't know, where the claw curled around and went in through the bottom, it's still swollen. It's misshapen. And he's basically going to be maimed for the rest of his life. I mean, it's not a huge deal, and he doesn't act like it hurts him anymore, but I look at that every day, and I think about the way he was taken from me, and how that never would have happened to him. And the people responsible for that, well, hopefully they are watching this video, because they know who they are, and they know what they've done. So by that time, I was in better physical shape. I was recovered enough from the surgery, and I started looking for work because I had to find an income somehow. Over those months, I applied for literally hundreds of jobs. I went on maybe a dozen interviews out of all those hundreds of jobs. And in each and every case, it got down to the point where they did a pre-hiring background check, and they saw the charges that were pending against me, and they said, no thanks. As a matter of fact, I do have rejection letters from Uber and from Amazon services, and I will be showing them in another video. But since I had no lawyer, no money, and no access to legal services whatsoever, I was unrepresented after that, and my wife's lawyer used that opportunity to become very aggressive. The child support allegations were ramped up at that point. The police came in support of one of the investigations, and lo and behold, it was the same cop who arrested me. And by that time, we had developed a relationship. We knew each other. We were cordial with one another. Detective Troy El Haj, he's a nice guy. But of course, you know, he's on the other side of these allegations now, and he shows up with another detective, and they had cameras, and they took pictures of the baby, and they looked at each other and shook their heads and said, there's nothing wrong with this kid, and they apologized to me before they left. And the detective shook my hand, and he said, I hope this all turns out better for you, and I hope to meet you under better circumstances someday. And there's really nothing I could say to that. So a hearing was held during this time, and at that point, another pre-trial statement opportunity was missed. And this was around the time I found out that you're supposed to be making pre-trial statements. Since I was representing myself, I learned what I could. It wasn't enough. I'm not a lawyer. And the way the judge looked at me in all of those hearings let me know that representing myself would not be an option. In fact, she at one point spoke out and said, you need to get a lawyer, and pro bono services are available. And she's a new judge, very inexperienced, and you could tell she had her mind made up what was going on already. And the fact that I had been turned down for pro bono legal services wasn't, you know, of concern to her. So during that hearing, I remember, is when my wife's lawyer successfully pressed for supervised custody of the baby, which meant that during my regular periods of custody with the baby, there had to be someone agreed upon by the court there at all times to supervise my interactions with him. Even though time after time these allegations had proven to be unfounded, her lawyer was really aggressive, extremely dishonest. She presented a lot of things that she knew to be factually incorrect, as factually incorrect. And the judge, I guess, saw herself as an empty vessel for lawyers to fill with bullshit. Because although the judge could have easily found out on her own that my wife's lawyer was lying about this stuff, she wouldn't do it. And I guess maybe she's not supposed to. You know, I don't know how all that works. All I know is that the only people that I could get to supervise my custody were my parents, because all the other places were paid supervising agencies. And they would have had to send someone to my house to sleep overnight at my house while I had my baby. My parents live over an hour away. They're in their 70s. My mother is going blind. She lost her license due to macular degeneration. My dad has extensive spinal issues. As a matter of fact, he just had surgery to do some vertebral fusing. And the baby wouldn't be calm for anybody but me. So not only am I trying to look for a job, I'm trying to look for a job that will let me spend my days of custody with my baby at home, well, at my parents' house, an hour away, watching my son, because he wouldn't be calm for my parents. It was stressful for them. It was stressful for me. And in the end, my parents were unable to continue supervising the custody nearly as much as I had the baby. And, you know, they went away for a while, and it ended up that I wasn't able to see the baby at all. So around the time that was happening, my older son, who was extremely upset by all of this, came to me with information that changed everything. He'd been keeping it to himself, and it absolutely changed the entire nature of what had happened to me through this entire procedure. So now we're going to talk about that.